really alter fundamental qualia or features even, like color and shape and size and direction of motion. So I'm going to start going through this PowerPoint, which I hope you can see. All right. Can you see that?
Yeah.
All right. So the basic idea that I'm going to reiterate again and again is that attention can alter bottom-up processing. But it can't do that, you know, by going all the way down to the retina, because there are no actually axons going down from the cortex to the retina that we know of. But what attention can do is it can specify a domain, such as a layer or a surface or a boundary, within which subsequent bottom-up operations will take place. And the results of those bottom-up operations can lead to radically different experiences, as different as seeing something as yellow, and then at the next moment seeing it as blue, even though at the level of the stimulus it hasn't changed. So I was just going to show lots of demos to support that chapter that I said, but then Stan said I had to show lots of data, so I quickly added data from papers, and that'll be mostly at the end. All right, so we know for sure that there's a lot of bottom-up processing, and that means there's processing that's driven by the stimulus, and a lot of bottom-up processing cannot be altered by attention. So, you know, a typical example of that would be this. So if close your right eye and look at the screen. So what you're doing now is you're adapting neurons to this color, and I'll let you do that for about 10 seconds. And in the next frame, I'm going to switch to a different color. And when I do that, I want you to switch eyes, so cover then the other eye. I'm going to switch now, cover the other eye, and look at this. So now you're adapting the other eye to a different color. And what you'll experience in about 10 seconds when I ask you to, what you're going to do is you're going to look at some surface in the room, like a nice white wall or something, and then look alternately with one eye and then the other. Okay, now go look at some surface in the room, a nice white surface with one eye and then the other. And you'll notice that your perceived colors are different in the two eyes because you've adapted the two eyes differently. Okay, so attention really doesn't seem to be able to alter that kind of thing. Another example of that would be after images. So you can see there's nothing there. We'll create an after image now, fixate the center. And when I, in about 10 seconds, switch back to the previous screen, you'll have beautiful after images, but those after images are not in the world. They're due to adaptation in your retina, and attention cannot really alter that. So here we go. Those colors that you now see are not in the world, but in your brain. All right. So there's a lot that attention cannot do. Here's a famous example. You know, fixate the little dot on the left, and you'll create an after image of a American flag. Okay, now switch over to the right side, and you'll very briefly see an American flag. And okay, so now we also know, in addition to the fact that there's lots of bottom-up processing, we know that there's lots of top-down processing. And really the question of this talk is how the two interact. So what's an example of top-down processing? Well, let's just give a nice example there. But males, if you're male, if you are an XY, close your eyes. Just shut them. And if you're a woman, keep your eyes open. Okay, now, women, close your eyes. And men, open your eyes. Look at the screen. Women, keep your eyes closed. Okay, now everybody open your eyes. Okay, if you saw a seal just now, say, I saw a seal.
Yeah, I saw a seal.
Okay, and if you saw a donkey just now, say, I saw a donkey. Okay, so some of you saw that, and some of you saw that. And so this is an example of priming. And when I showed you this ambiguous thing, it can either be seen as a seal or a donkey. And if you were primed to see a donkey, you were more likely to see a donkey, and vice versa. So that would be an example of a kind of top-down processing. It's really not due to attention. It's more like semantic priming. All right. Now, the kind of top-down processing I'm interested in is the kind of top-down processing that can reach down into preconscious operations and alter them. So the first people, I think, to really dwell on this issue of mental operations were the Gestalt psychologists. Maybe it was Helmholtz before them, but there was kind of an awakening in Germany in the 1880s to the 1920s or so. And interestingly, following really in the steps of Immanuel Kant, there was an awareness that our perception is the result of operations like grouping operations that go into the construction of what we subsequently consciously experience. And I feel that the Gestalt psychologists really threw down a kind of gauntlet on the table that has not really been deeply answered yet. It's really a great challenge to work out what those operations are. So in the footsteps of the great Gestalt psychologists, I'm going to present some work here. So here's a standard sort of Gestalty kind of example. You can choose to see this as a different shape. Like you can see it as an X on a background, or you can see it as a sort of diamond. There's lots of things you can do. And this is another example from Rubin in 1915. You can see this as two faces, or you can see it as a vase. And I'm sure you all saw this kind of thing in Psych 1. In the 1880s to 1920s, actually all of Europe kind of went nuts with these sorts of ambiguous figures. And you can see this famous one either as an old woman looking down to her, well, to my left, or a young woman looking back. So you've probably all seen these examples. And you can choose volitionally to see one versus the other. So we know there's some kind of top-down operation that allows us to change the interpretation of an ambiguous stimulus like this.
Oh.
You can choose to see these triangles all as pointing downward and to the left, or all pointing upward or downward to the right. So there's some sort of volitional aspect to this that allows us to alter how we experience a single stimulus. Okay, I drew this little weird figure. Fixating there, you can choose to make any end the head. And if you make whatever, if you choose to make, say, the right side of the head, it looks sort of like a weird crane. If you make the top of the head, it looks sort of like a pterodon or something. But the stimulus doesn't change. And what's really changing is how this ambiguous sort of Rorschach test-like thing is interpreted and experienced. Here's something I drew that can either be seen as a white column surrounded by black rings, in which case you see a white surface under those rings accompanied by sort of illusory contours, or you can flip it in your head and see it as sort of bracelets hanging in the air with a gap facing forward. That might be a little more difficult to do, but what's interesting to me is if you're able to accomplish that flip in your head, the illusory contours go away. So illusory contours are not, they don't follow necessarily from the stimulus. They follow from these operations that lead to a certain interpretation. And as part of that interpretation, you either get illusory contours or you don't. You can take an ambiguous figure like this, and you can interpret it either as a white octopus hugging a gray rock, or a gray octopus hugging a white rock from behind. And you can volitionally flip back and forth. So there's a lot of Gestalt-like demonstrations that make clear, I think, that we have, to some degree, volitional control of how we will experience a stimulus that is itself unchanging. Okay, so the kind of bottom-up operations that I'm really interested in today are constancy operations. And these constancy operations are generally involved in recovering intrinsic facts about the world. So what is an object's true size, its true shape, what's its true pigment, what's its true direction of motion. And if you didn't have constancy operations, you'd be in big trouble, because then a person, when they walked away from you, would look like they're actually becoming smaller, when in fact it's just the image projection that's getting smaller. Or say a cat with white hair, if it ran under a blue light, it would reflect blue light, and in the absence of color constancy operations, you would think the cat actually had blue pigment. So these constancy operations seem to be a kind of bottom-up operation that attention can go down and manipulate, leading to often a very different outcome. So here's a sort of Lotto and Purvis's example of Ted Adelson's sort of demos, where in one case, the middle patch above looks brown in pigment, and the middle patch in front looks kind of orange. But in the image, they're identical. And the difference is that one lies in shadow. And in order to recover the pigment, you have to discount the shadow to recover the pigment. And it must be a lighter pigment if it is under shadow, leading to the same value at the retina. All right, so we know that we are able to recover true pigments more or less, but a camera really can't. Under one kind of light, a camera would see this or picture this, and under a different kind of light, say incandescent light, it would reflect this. So this is actually closer to what's coming into the eye under these different kinds of light situations, but we are able to recover, we are able to discount the illuminant and recover the reflectance properties of surfaces. Because as Ken knows, and was the first to really emphasize after Gibson, surfaces are really where it's at. You want to recover intrinsic properties of surfaces and objects. All right, so here's just some really nice demos of color constancy, right? So the blue square in the picture on the left is exactly the same color in the image as the red square in the picture on the right. And yet on the left, it looks like blue pigment, and on the right, it looks like pinkish pigment. And it's hard to believe because our conscious experience can't reach all the way down to the image or what's going on at the retina. Our conscious experience is largely post-constancy operation, where the pigment has been recovered and the illuminant has been discounted already. So I can prove this to you if I cut that out on the right and move it to the left. Right, so I put those two next to each other. Now we can do a direct comparison and see that they are, in fact, the same image color. I'll move it back. And it's sort of cognitively impenetrable. You can't really recover the image properties, even though now you cognitively know that they're the same in the image. And this is Ted Adelson's sort of brightness version of that. A and B are identical in the image, but B looks like a lighter reflectance or paint. Okay, so then there's this really amazing artist in Japan called Akihiro Kitaoka, who's just got tremendous phenomenological talent. And so he's made some just wonderful demos about color constancy that I'll show you now. So the girl on the left and the girl on the right have the same image value skin color, but on the left, she looks like she has white skin, and on the right, she looks like she has dark skin. That's because the girl on the left can be interpreted as lying under sort of a gray filter. And if that's true, or if she lies in shadow, and you're recovering the same number or luminance value at the retina, it must be that it's reflecting off of a lighter surface. And that's how we experience it. And this is true for color too. So Kitaoka has drawn these wonderful pictures where, for example, the girl on the left looks like she has blue eyes. But what's actually going on at the level of the retina or the image is a gray iris in both cases. Now, how can that be, right? How can we see this so incorrectly? I can prove it to you by moving the eyes from the right to the left, and you can see they're the identical gray. So what Kitaoka is doing is taking advantage of our own constancy operations. The girl on the left is interpreted to lie under a red filter. So if at the retina you're recovering a gray, well, the only color that passes through a red filter that gives rise to gray is blue. So you recover a blue pigment after the constancy operation. Okay, now this is a bigger example of that. You can see the same gray value. Here's other examples, right? So in each individual image, the girl's left and right retina, irises are identical in gray value in the image, but you can see they look radically different in brightness on the left or color on the two ones on the right. And it's just simply amazing. I mean, I think the one on the right is just astounding, right? So there's the same color values in the retina, on the irises on the girl on the right. And yet you experience them consciously as having radically different pigments. So let's blow that case up. And what Kitaoka did is he drew this little hairband thing to match the perceived color under the blue filter. And if you don't believe this, I can actually move her eyes over. And if you still don't believe it, I can blow it up. And if you blow it up, you can see that it's identical at the iris. But again, it's cognitively impenetrable because you cannot see the left eye and the right eye as having the same iris color, even though you cognitively know that they are identical in the image at the level of what's detected at the retina. Here's some other examples. I'm just showing them because they're so awesome. Right? So in each case, the irises are identical within a given girl. Here's a sort of a real-life version. It's actually gray. All right. So then the question is, can attention alter perceived color? And I will argue yes. So here's some examples of attention altering perceived gray brightness. So in this case, fixate one of the dots, probably the one in the middle, and simply take your volitional or endogenous attention and pay attention to one figure. And whichever figure you attend to should subjectively seem to recede to the background, become opaque, and become, in this case, slightly darker in brightness, or less bright. And this applies also to the flip. So in this case, if you volitionally pay attention while fixating the center there to one of the white disks, it should become more opaque, go to the back, and seem to become subjectively brighter.
When I did that from your book, the Handbook of Experimental Phenomenology, it was a stronger effect.
Okay, well, you know, yeah.
Now maybe.
Might be I don't know what your projector conditions are, what the lighting conditions are.
Maybe deep on the back.
Okay, anyway, I would argue that this also works to some degree for color. So if you fixate the center there and pay attention to, say, the blue disk, it starts to look sort of like a blue disk that has these transparent color filters in front of it. Or if you attend to, say, the red disk, it looks like a red disk with transparent green and blue filters in front of it. But the central overlap region is, in fact, gray all the time. Does that work for people or not?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another example. So here, say you're fixating the center and you attend to the red disk. It should look like a red disk covered by transparent filters. Or if you tend to, say, the green disk, it should look like a green disk covered by transparent filters. But what's interesting is in the gray region in the middle, the interpreted color appears to change. And this even works when you're just dealing with two surfaces. So here's some examples. Let's just look at the one on the lower left. Let me blow that up. Okay, so fixate the center there. And pay attention volitionally to, say, the blue surface. Now, when you do that, it should look like a blue, opaque, pigmented surface behind a transparent yellow filter. But when you flip it and pay attention now to the yellow rectangle, it should look like the opposite, like more like a yellow piece of paper behind a blue transparency. And so you're playing here with your color constancy operation because gray is consistent with two interpretations. It's either a yellow pigment passing through a blue filter or a blue pigment or light reflected from a blue reflectance surface through a yellow surface, a yellow transparent surface. And in either case, that would give rise to gray on the retina. And so you can change your perceived experience by attentionally manipulating which object you attend to. Does that work for people?
No, it doesn't work for me.
It's actually more dramatic than the other one. Maybe it's size.
Okay, well, some of this, I'm happy to send this PowerPoint to people if they want to play with it. All right. Okay, so, right, so attention can modulate perceived color and brightness. Now let's look at size. So you learned in Psych 1 or 101 about size constancy, and you saw this image probably from the 50s, where that woman in the back looks like a normal-sized woman, but when you move her up front, she looks like a tiny woman, right? So this is a result of size constancy, where your goal, or the goal of the visual system, is to recover the true size of objects, regardless of their image size. So attention can also alter perceived size, and so you can see that in this demo. So here is an example of the Ponzo illusion, and you can fixate the center dot, and you can choose to pay attention to just one of the train tracks. Whichever train tracks you attend to, there's going to be one object that's closer and one object that's farther away relative to that image, and your perceived size should follow that. So the one that seems to be farther away should appear to be bigger than the one that's closer. So you can manipulate the Ponzo illusion by paying attention to one transparent surface there or the other. Even though, so the images, the two red ellipses are the same size in the image, but you can make one seem larger or smaller at will by paying attention to the background. So basically, attention is allowing you to define a domain, say one of the train tracks in this case, that then will be subject to constancy operations, in this case, size constancy operations. Does that work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
All right. Now, how about shape?
I just want to comment that some of those were in the book, and so I looked up at the references, and there are data points with error bars.
Oh, I'm going to show lots of data points, and don't worry, Stan.
Okay.
But not yet. All right. So, so shape constancy is another example of trying to recover an intrinsically true thing about the world or an object. We don't want to perceive doors opening and closing as changing their shape. In fact, we want to perceive them as a rigid door that happens to be changing its orientation relative to us. So that operation is a shape constancy operation. Now, sometimes these things kind of fail. Here's a picture from my brook near my house. And when you look at this, it looks kind of strange. And the reason for that is that it's upside down. This is what's really going on. It's a rock that's concave, which is not something you see every day. And I showed it to you upside down, and your constancy operations created the wrong interpretation, namely that what's actually the lip of the caldera, so to speak, is the self-occluding rim of the object. But this is what's really going on, and the reason for that is that there's a lot of assumptions that go into these constancy operations. In the case of shape constancy, one of the assumptions is that we're looking down on objects from above. So here's another example. When you look at this, it looks like the center part is a sort of nubble coming up into the air. But when I flip the same image upside down, it looks sort of like a valley. And that only can happen under the assumption that objects are being viewed from above. All right. So now the question is, can attention modulate perceived shape? And I'll argue, yes, it can, for the same reason, by defining the domain of some shape constancy operation. All right, so here's something that Mark Albert and I came up with 20-something years ago. So if you look at, say, the object on the right, it looks sort of like think of those little diamonds as Post-its. Well, the one on the front is sort of stuck to the surface, but the one on the side of the object on the right is sort of peeling off or something. If you pay attention to the cuboid there in the middle, it's the opposite. Now the same diamond looks like it's sort of lifting off the surface, whereas the one in front looks like it's attached. So you can play attentionally, volitionally with the object on the left, and you can make that sort of Necker version of this object have one configuration, like the object in the middle or the one on the right, at will, in which case that will alter whether the Post-it seems to be fully attached to the surface or sort of peeling off. All right. And I'll give you now another example of this. So this kind of silhouette looks like it's kind of different shapes. The one on the left, I don't know, it looks kind of like a weird rock to me, and the one on the right looks like a Hershey's Kiss. But in fact, it's the same silhouette. It's the same silhouette rotated 90 degrees. Now, why might that be? Notice that on the object on the left, there's a ground plane, and the ground plane seems to be touching this long bottom edge of the object, whereas on the right, it's touching the sort of curved Hershey's Kiss bottom. And I can take the same silhouette and put it in a different context. For example, here, now the Hershey's Kiss is not the vertical one, but the horizontal one, and vice versa. So it seems that these shape constancy operations have this built-in assumption that objects are resting on ground planes and that objects conform to the surface that they're lying on. And all of this is unconscious, but it'll allow us now to create an intentional version of this where you can manipulate which shape you choose to see. So this might be a little hard. There's a sort of Necker version there on the lower left. And depending on how you flip it in your head, you can choose to see that same silhouette as sort of a Hershey's Kiss or as that weird rock shape, depending on which surface is the supporting surface. So we can conclude here that attention, volitional attention, can also alter perceived shape. I would argue again because it's defining a domain within which subsequent shape constancy operations take place. All right, now let's go to motion. Motion is especially interesting because it's constructed over time. It's not due to a single image. So this is an example of apparent motion. Everybody who sees vertical motion here say, yes, I see vertical.
Yes. Yes.
Everybody who sees horizontal say, yes, I see horizontal.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know, about half. Well, let's say whatever you see, you can create the opposite. Let's say that you see vertical now. Well, cover the bottom two with your hand, and you will now see horizontal. Now take your hand away. Now, with practice, you can develop sort of attentional muscles and choose to see the motion you want. And I have this sort of fantasy of creating the attentional Olympics, but I haven't figured out how to score it. But you know, if you have really strong attentional muscles, you should be able to even make this rotate. Okay, so now Stan, I'm going to give you some data. We're moving towards data. All right, so imagine a really tiny version of this. Sorry. Okay. We did an experiment where this sort of apparent motion stimulus is all within less than half a visual degree, so it's really tiny. This is the version that's actually coming out next month or so in Vision Research. But what we wanted to see was whether top-down volitional attention can alter whether you see, in this case, it can be interpreted either as vertical or horizontal. And we had these catch trials that forced people to see vertical or horizontal, and I'm only going to show you data from people who are honest about seeing horizontal when they had to have seen horizontal in the catch trials. And then, this is the key thing, we gave people a tone, either high or low, boop or boop, and the tone initially had no meaning for the subjects. We ran them in one experiment, and they heard these tones, but they didn't mean anything. Then we ran them again, and we told them, when you hear the high tone, try to see either vertical or horizontal, depending on the subject. And when you hear the low tone, try to see the opposite. And I'm going to show you those data because I think they're really interesting and surprising. All right, so before they knew what the tones meant, the proportion of perceived motion that's consistent with the tone, you would think would be a chance, and it is. And this is I think 22 subjects here. But then we told them the meaning of the tone, and we ran the whole experiment over, and we said, volitionally try to see vertical when you hear this tone, and volitionally try to see horizontal when you see that tone. In that case, this is after they knew what the tones meant, and this is a lot of data went into this. In this case, they were able to volitionally see what they wanted to see. But what's really, really surprising about this is that the command could happen after the motion actually flipped on the screen. In this case, up to about 180 milliseconds, suggesting that volitional control can be exerted on bottom-up operations after the input has already entered the cortex, as late as a couple of 100 milliseconds after the stimulus switch. Now, the reviewers, when they got this, they said, we just don't believe this. It's not believable. People were thinking the wrong way. They thought this entails that the future can alter the past, which obviously in reality it can't. But the future can alter input that came in the past in the brain, because there's a kind of buffer between, a temporal buffer between the time of retinal activation and the time of your conscious experience. And top-down operations can reach down, attention can reach down into that buffer before you consciously experience what's going on in the world, and say, and alter how the bottom-up operation will take place, and your subsequent conscious experience can obey that. But these reviewers were very, very difficult, and they said, we just don't believe that. You have to run the whole thing again, which is a pain, but we did it. And this time it was 68 subjects, okay? So it's a ton of subjects. So here again, we're before they knew what the tones meant, in different subjects. Again, your chance. And then this is after they knew what the tones meant. And again, now you can go out, we reach significance even after the tones happen close to 300 milliseconds after the event in the world. So what's going on? It seems that there's this kind of period before our conscious experience, and that our conscious experience is not at the moment of retinal activation. I mean, it stands to reason that our conscious experience will be later than the retinal activation, but the question is how long? Well, if it took 20 minutes, you'd never be able to catch anything, catch a ball or hit a ball. But if it were instantaneous, and our conscious experience was driven directly by the stimulus, we would not be able to have these constancy operations that allow us to recover what's really true about the world. So there's been an evolution, a kind of speed-accuracy trade-off, where conscious experience is the result of these constancy operations that allow us to have a relatively true representation of what's happening in the world. And it's pretty fast, maybe a quarter of a second to 350 milliseconds after the event in the world, allowing us to still hit a ball, and yet still see things as they presumably are. All right, here's another example. This is work I did with Ken way back in the days, like 1994 or something. So here's just two images. And what all of you are probably experiencing is that middle bar shooting across and sucking back in. That's kind of surprising because the image is in fact appearing all at once. But our conscious experience here is of this event that has a dynamic property. We call this transformational apparent motion. Now, the initial claim was actually that this, of Shinshimojo and Hikosaka and Miyauchi, was that this was actually driven by attention, and we challenged that. We argued that when that bar comes on, in fact, all at once, the reason that it is perceived as shooting from the left and not from the right is that it is processed as having been a change of the object on the left because it shares contour continuity with only the object on the left. And so there has to be, we reasoned, a kind of stage of parsing that precedes a stage of motion computation. And so we rejected the attentional account. But more recently, we've asked, well, maybe there is a role for attention here, that it's not the view of Hikosaka, Miyauchi, and Shimojo, which was that, attention allows prior entry of, say, the attended stimulus into your processing. We don't buy that. But what seems to be going on is it's this sort of defining of a domain for parsing. So in this case, fixate, say, the point above, in the middle. And I'm going to add a bar, and I want you to attend to, say, I don't know, I'll be arbitrary here. Pay attention to the little object on the lower left. As hard as you can, the lower left, and now I'm going to add a bar, lower left. Who saw it go left to right? Yeah. Who saw it go right to left? Well, anyway, we've been collecting data on this, and how you attend to this affects how you see it. Here's an experiment that a student of mine, Kevin Hartstein, just did. This is all unpublished. But basically, he created a situation where people were given, say, 4 squares in the corners, and then he added a bar between any two of them, and he cued them. There's a little tiny red arrow there that you can't see, but it's saying pay attention to the lower left, pay attention to the upper right. And the data that's hot off the presses is this, both in second order versions and first order versions. I don't know what to make about the points on the left, but if you're looking at different stimulus onset asynchronies from the appearance of the arrow saying attend, say, to the lower left, if the stimulus onset asynchrony, when the appearance of the bar actually happens, is beyond about 200 milliseconds, there is a bias to see the line shoot out of the attended object. And those are the significant points on the right. But I won't talk about that in too much detail. But it looks like attention can also alter perceived direction, both in apparent motion of the form of standard apparent motion and transformational apparent motion. And as the previous data showed, it can even do this after the apparent motion happened in the world. All right, so now let me show you this example. This is an example where you can volitionally alter your after images. So you'll notice on the right, there's just empty space inside those boxes. Fixate the center fixation point of the one on the left. All right, so what you're doing by fixating is you're going to be adapting neurons. And the point of this demo is to show that you can volitionally take control of your after images. And this is work that builds on Rob Van Leer's and Stuart Ansis's sort of exogenous version of this. This is an endogenous version that I came up with. Now, keep fixating. In about 10 seconds, I'm going to have you move your eyes to the point on the right, and you'll see a strong after image. And if you pay attention volitionally to the vertical box, you'll see vertical after image stripes. And if you pay attention at your own will and timing to the horizontal box, you'll see horizontal stripes. So now move your eyes to the right and volitionally control whether you see vertical stripes or horizontal stripes in the after image by paying attention to one box versus the other. Does that work?
Not really.
No?
I think it's too dark.
Okay, maybe it's too dark. I don't know what your lighting conditions are. Anyway, here are some data. Oh, no, I won't do this one if it's not working. This was a little joke I made with a German flag or a Greek flag, trying to see who's going to leave the EU first. All right, anyway, so in the actual experiment, we had different conditions, and these are the data. Basically, if you are attending to, say, the horizontal box, you're more likely to see the...
We lost you.
The case C is especially interesting because it's totally overlapping. And if people willed to see the vertical stripes in the box, they were able to. And if they willed to see the horizontal, they were able to. Anyway, so these are some data. You can look at the paper if you want more details. All right, so now I'm going to turn to some other another motion demo. So this is a kind of a neat case that is built on the work of Patrick Cavanaugh and Stuart Ansis. I have to switch now to a movie. Hold on. Give me a chance here. All right, I think it's this. Can you see this?
Yeah.
You can see a disc?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm going to set it in motion. Well, actually, before I set it in motion, I'm going to move it to the point where the red dots appear. The red dots, in fact, appear at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. There.
Yeah.
So that's reality, and this is work I did with David Whitney in the room and others. Right. So, but you can alter how the I always forget if this is flash drag or flash lag, or but anyway, I'll set it in motion. Okay. So now, if you fixate the blue spot and you pay attention to the white rotating surface layer, the red dot should now appear to be at 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock. But if you pay attention to the black rotating transparent layer, the dots will appear to go to 11 o'clock and 5 o'clock.
Really?
So volitional attention here alters the outcomes of this assignment of position relative, which is itself influenced by motion, as you know, this is David Whitney's world, not mine. But again, it's indirect. It's not that attention is moving objects around. It's not moving positions around. What attention is doing here is it's defining a layer or a domain within which the subsequent bottom-up operations will take place. And the result of that is a radically different position assignment. Does that work?
Didn't work for me.
Okay, you have to really have strong attentional muscles and pay attention only to one layer. So I find it's good to pay attention to, say, the outlying most dots.
The trouble is reversing, Peter. The black dots are always going counterclockwise and clockwise, and so you can't really. I don't know why, but I think you need to have them go
in one direction.
go in one direction, so you know what.
Okay, well, look, everybody fixate the blue dot in the center and pay attention to the big outlying black dots, not white, only the black dots at the edge. Just pay attention to those dots. And if you do that, I would argue the dots should seem to be shifted sort of counterclockwise. Not at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, but more like 11 o'clock and 5 o'clock.
No, I see the shift, but you are reversing the dots all the time, and so then you don't have a consistent thing here. That's okay.
No, but the red dots are always, in fact, at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock.
The black dots are rotating one way, and then they're rotating another direction.
That's intentional.
That's true, but that doesn't matter. What matters is the assignment of the red dots to a position.
Peter, you've got artifacts. The video's not working. Too many artifacts, too many skipped frames.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. We're dealing with. Okay, sorry guys. There's a bad. Zoom is not working properly. All right. So
we're going over Skype or something, so that's really kind of hard to do.
Well, Stan, I sent you the movie. Anyway, I'll send you guys the movie. It's really a nice demo. I'm sorry it doesn't work. All right. So
that's a good thing to know about Zoom. That it's not perfect.
All right. So now I'm going to show you another motion demo. Hold on. Where is it? I've lost it.
For me, it worked with the white block. The white one, the red one was in 1.7.
Does anybody know if this could be an experiment for EEG because it's a flash, and if it's localized, it's a substantial thing. It should be. Do you know, or David or anybody, has this been trying to figure out where in the brain?
All right. Here's another example. Can you guys see this? Are we getting too many lost frames? Is it jerky or smooth?
It's smooth. Yeah, it's smooth.
Okay. So here's another sort of example where you can volitionally manipulate what you experienced, following in the footsteps of the Gestalt psychologist. So my guess is that most of you who haven't seen this before are experiencing something like a black cross that's deforming, or these two rods that have these weird ends that are sort of deforming. But what I'd like you to do is alter how you experience this by imagining that there's four pieces of, say, white paper.
One piece, here's two pieces, here's three pieces, here's four pieces. There's 4 pieces of white. It took me about 10 minutes when we were practicing this before the class. Does anybody see with these 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces?
And imagine now behind those 4 pieces of paper, you see a rotating black ellipse, a rigidly rotating black ellipse.
It's
Some of you
dramatic.
will get it.
It took me forever to see it, though.
Yes.
Now, can anybody see the ellipse?
Yes. Wow.
Cool.
Okay, so the single stimulus can be experienced in radically different ways. And, following on Ken's work, it's really the border ownership or really changes in these different interpretations. Now, there's a third interpretation for you people who are sort of phenomenological athletes, and that is harder to get, but I think some of you will be able to get it. Imagine that you're looking at the world through an elliptical tube, and that elliptical tube is rotating. So now you're looking through a rotating elliptical window at a static black cross
I got that one first, actually.
What?
Oh, you're in.
reflects that interpretation. Can anyone do that?
Yep.
Yeah.
So the single stimulus can be interpreted in three radically different ways: a rotating elliptical window, a rotating black ellipse in the world, or this sort of cross shape. And I would argue that volitional attention can allow you to some degree to flip back and forth between these interpretations and see things in radically different ways.
Can you send this movie?
I sent Stan the movie already. He can share it.
I can send it out to everybody.
Great.
I can. How much time do I have left?
It's very dramatic.
Yes, very dramatic.
You know, we would like to have at some point discussion. So
Okay. Yeah, I'll wrap it up in a second then. Let me just finish then. Hold on. I want to share. How do I share this? Hold on a second. Let me get back to my PowerPoint.
For the meantime, I'm going to talk next week. I'm just, if you want to look at a video that I've
oh, the
assigned,
glasses.
these
That's
glasses,
right.
somebody can just take these and not here. You can watch a video that is on Stan's syllabus.
All right. So we're basically by the end here. Okay. Yeah. So I'll just show one final version of attention before concluding, which is not mine. It's the McGurk effect. But I want to just make the point that attention can also alter auditory experience. So let me go to the demo of the McGurk effect, which you probably know. 1 second. Okay, hold on. Now, what do you guys see?
Not really. We see your internet window, and we see how it's going.
Okay, hold on a second. I'm gonna try to get you the demo of the McGurk effect. For some reason, it's not. Here we go. All right. So, do you see? I'll just quit this. I'm trying to show you the internet. Hold on. I'm having trouble here. Here. I see. Okay, I got it. Now, do you see the McGurk effect?
We'll see it there.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is an interesting demo from the BBC. So this guy is going to be saying either ba or ga or da or something. And depending on how you attend, whether paying attention to it, the left version of him or the right version of him will affect the sound that you hear. So here's from the BBC.
No sound.
We have to.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we have to go back. Okay. Then go to YouTube and type in, find this video, which is try the McGurk effect, I guess.
Try the McGurk effect.
Are you finding it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's done.
Go to 39 seconds.
We have to watch
At
ad.
any one moment,
Oh,
we
yeah,
are
yeah.
being bombarded.
Yeah, sorry about this.
Our brains do a remarkable job, because this isn't always the case. Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, 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 ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, 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 ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba,
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
ba,
Take another look.
ba.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
Ba,
now to the left of the screen. The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion,
Okay, you can turn it off.
see overrides what we hear.
So
The mouth movements we see as we look at it.
So what's interesting about this example from the BBC is that when they show the two heads, and you attend, and you can do this in a more controlled way. You could, fixate one point and then pay attention to the left face, and you'll hear one sound, and pay attention to the right face without moving your eyes, and you'll hear a very different sound. So the McGurk effect follows that, just as in the visual cases, there's sort of constancy operations that are trying to recover the true shape that was made in the world, but it's influenced by visual input, and attention can choose a domain. That's the main point I want to make. Attention, in one case, you pay attention to the left head, and the McGurk effect follows from the sound constancy operations applied to that stimulus, visual stimulus, or vice versa. So let me just end before I take questions, with the main point that what I think is going on is that attention doesn't directly alter perceived features or qualia. What it does is it defines a domain, like a surface or a head or an object, over which subsequent bottom-up operations that are designed to recover the true properties of the world are then carried out. And if you're clever about it, you can find cases where these constancy operations for a single stimulus lead to radically different outcomes, whether that's a single stimulus being perceived to be blue or yellow, or a single stimulus being perceived to be ba or da, or big or small, or this size, this shape or that shape. And so attention can alter qualia, but only in this very indirect and interesting way. All right, I'll stop there and I'll take questions.
Thank you. Okay, and the first questions go to students who have written down a question. Can anybody here have a piece of paper? Or those with the papers? Okay, yeah.
I was wondering if this works the same way that.
Oh, please, you got to speak louder. I'm really kind of hard of hearing.
Can you get to the speaker?
You could just come up closer.
So I was wondering if shifts in attention to a visual image works in the same way that you can interpret the same word in two different sentences. Like, I don't know if, yeah, like if there's the same word that can have two different meanings depending on its context within.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if okay, here's an example, right? So the word WOMEN in English means women, but in Mandarin it means us or we. Now, if I'm in China and I see pinyin written somewhere, I'll interpret it to mean we. But if I'm in America, I'll interpret it to mean women. There's just tons of examples like that where context influences how we interpret an ambiguous stimulus.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions from students? Yes, go for it.
So you've been saying attention select a channel and then preconscious processing happen only in that domain or channel. How do you know that it's not the other way around? Like preconscious processing happen and then attention select a domain.
So this is sort of, is attention operating early or late?
Yeah.
So under the late interpretation, everything would get processed up to the level of fully interpreted events and objects, whereas under the sort of, well, not early exactly, but sort of mid-level action of attention story, not everything gets processed up to a level of full-blown interpretation. My answer would be that the results of these operations show that the constancy operations, whether for pigment or size or shape, seem to apply to the attended channel, if you want to call it that. And it's not the case that, I don't believe it's a kind of late selection where every possible conclusion is reached. So, you know, take the example of, say, that blue and yellow little stimulus that I drew. So under a late attentional account, you know, one channel is creating a blue surface behind a yellow transparent filter, and in another channel, you have a yellow pigmented surface behind a blue transparent filter, and attention would then just select between those. Yeah, I don't believe that that's going on. I think that the constancy operations are probably very expensive and time consuming, and you wouldn't want to, you know, have all interpretations happen at once. But I'm open to being wrong. I mean, you know, maybe the brain doesn't work the way I think it does, and some rivalry experiments seem to suggest that there is kind of late stimulus selection. So yeah, to some degree, I think the jury is out.
This is such a great question. I'd like to continue with that. The question is, which comes first, the attention thing or the other effect? And my question to you is, how slow is attention? How does one measure the beginning of an attention or the end of an attention?
Okay, well, I mean, I'll throw the ball back in Ken's court. Like 1989 or something, he wrote a paper with Manfred McCabe, where he actually measured the time course of attentional shifting. And, you know, there's different kinds of attention. Exogenous attention is really fast. Ken called it transient, but it decays quickly. Whereas endogenous attention or volitional attention is slow to get there. It could take up to 150 milliseconds to be allocated there. But once it's there, it can stay there for a long time, maybe as long as you will it to stay there.
So how do you measure, how I can ask Ken, but how do you measure?
Well, I didn't measure endogenous attention at all. I just studied exogenous attention. It was fast, but not that fast. It took maybe, depending on the situation, took like 80 milliseconds or to reach peak.
No, well, Ken, it's your work. You know better than me. But as I remember it, you study transient and sustained attention, and I think those are identical. I think they're identical to exogenous and endogenous attention. And if I remember the data correctly, exogenous attention or transient attention gets to the stimulus about 80 milliseconds. 80 milliseconds, but it fades quickly. Whereas sustained attention, which is what you called it, or endogenous attention, takes longer, like 150 milliseconds, but then it stays there in a sustained way.
Right.
So, you know, this is your course is to some, your course. Wait, let me make one more point, Ken, sorry. What we call consciousness is sort of this domain of representations that I think is very tightly tied with volitional attention, because it's the domain of operands over which the operator that we call volitional attention seems to operate. So the three concepts of attention or endogenous attention, volition, and consciousness are deeply connected, like like a husband and a wife or a hammer and a nail. They're just inseparable. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Look, I'm very interested still in how to measure endogenous, or what was the word you used? The volitional, what was that?
I call it sustained.
Sustained.
Well, yes, sustained attention, volitional attention, and endogenous attention are synonyms, I think.
So how do you measure that? Does a person with a finger say I'm attending to this, and then when they shift attention, do they move their finger to another place?
Well, George Sperling and Adam Reed did an interesting experiment where they had two letter streams. They have fixation in the middle and two streams of letters or numbers or something like that. And you fixate in the middle, and you just have to read off, attend to the left or to the right, and then you have to shift your attention, and then how long does it take to start reading the other letters? And they measure. It's a complicated experiment, but it was a nice example of early example of endogenous attention shift. Wouldn't you say, Peter?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Stan, this giant literature that's all about trying to figure out how to measure the effects of endogenous attention or exogenous attention. And there's lots of different ways to measure it. I mean, attention has a lot of consequences like speeded reaction times. I would argue altered percepts. And these can be measured.
Okay, any other questions from people who have broad questions with them, prepared from just the reading? Or... Okay, Hal, go for it.
Peter, could you re-explain the operands and the operator model and tell us what functional components of the brain might be involved if you can do it succinctly?
Yeah, okay. If you want, I can send you a chapter from my book, The Neural Basis of Free Will, that talks a lot about this. But in a nutshell, let me put it this way. I think the field of psychology has been overly concerned with or a face or an object or a scene, and much less work has been done on the verbs of the mind, like volitional attention would be a process that executes.
You'll have to repeat. We lost your.
There are other mental operations, like mental rotation. So, for example, Roger Shepard really zoomed in.
Could you repeat that, please? We're getting a bad connection.
Oh, I'm sorry. Where did you lose me?
About 30 seconds ago.
Okay, I'll start over. All right. So I was saying that the field of psychology and neuroscience has been very concerned with the nouns of the mind. Think of that as representations like houses or objects, faces, scenes, and so forth. But there's been much less work done on the verbs of the mind. And by that I would mean mental operations that execute over the former type, over the operands, the objects. So for example, volitional attention is an example of a mental operation that is executed over operands. And there are other mental operations that are volitional. For example, volitional mental rotation would be one that was studied by Roger Shepard. But I think there's a lot of work to be done yet in this domain of looking at mental operations. And I would argue again that what we call consciousness is really a very specific type of operand or representation. It is the type of operand or representation that you can volitionally attend. So the relationship between consciousness and volitional attention is very, very tight. Anything that you're conscious of, you can shift your attention to or you're attending already. And anything that you're volitionally attending should be part of your conscious experience. So I challenge anybody in the room to think of an example of something that you can consciously experience that you cannot shift your volitional attention to, or that you're volitionally attending now, but you're not consciously experiencing. But there is a difference, right? It's a difference between sort of operand and operator. Consciousness is this domain of operands, some of which are currently being operated on, but some of which are not. And they become part of our experience as the visual background or the auditory background. Whereas the ones that we're processing right now volitionally become the figure.
Thank you. I'd like to see that chapter, indeed.
All right. Send me an email, please.
Dan, can you take care of that? That's part of Peter's book.
The Free Will book.
On MIT Press. Can you send that to us?
Wait.
Yeah, I'll send anybody who emails me, I'll send it to, or maybe I'll just send it to Stan and he can send it to people.
Send it to me.
All right.
This is a free copy of your whole book?
No,
just the chapter that talks about volitional attention and consciousness.
Got it. So anybody that's interested in this aspect of free will, in fact, this was a central question that I was going to ask. Several of the sections of the chapter that we read have to do with what is it called? Consciousness and did you use the word pre-conscious?
Pre-conscious.
Pre-conscious, yeah, pre-conscious and conscious. And I was going to ask you, how do you distinguish pre-conscious from conscious? And I guess you just answered that regarding volitional attention. But is that, the tricky part is some of this, a lot of your work has been to point out that the pre-conscious stage is very different from the conscious, but they're only separated by like 200 milliseconds. And can you actually control your timing of attention that accurately? I'm trying to understand this connection.
Well, okay, so going back all the way to the Gestalt psychologists, in whose footsteps I think Ken and I have followed, this is built on the idea that there's a lot of processing that happens before you can say, "Oh, I see," and that processing involves really pretty amazing operations that go from a 2D pixel-like pattern on the retina all the way up to a full-blown 3D interpreted story of what's going on in the world. I mean, you can really think of consciousness in a way as a sort of veridical hallucination about what's going on in the world. And it's full of inferences. And this is really Helmholtz's idea that there's unconscious inferences, which I think the Gestalt psychologists built on. And those inferences are part of these interpretive constancy operations and other operations that are trying to figure out what's really going on out in the world. So an example of that would be, let's say I go outside right now and I see that the ground is wet. Well, that's a full-blown interpretation of what's going on in the world, right? Because there's no concrete on my retina, there's no buildings on my retina, there's no water lying in puddles on my retina. When I go out and I see the world, I see it as very interpreted. That is the result of an inference, but it's not the kind of inference that philosophers talk about. It's an inference that's built into or that is the result of these preconscious and unconscious operations. So, for example, it's not that I go outside and I say, oh, well, there's, it's brighter in the top and it's darker in the left. Well, therefore, it must be raining out or wet out. No, I just see it as a fully interpreted story. And so a mantra for this would be seeing is seeing as. Now, I can look at the ground and see that it's wet, and then I can develop from that a further kind of inference. So we might call the former type a perceptual inference, whereas the latter type would be a cognitive inference. For example, I might say, oh, the ground is wet. Well, maybe it's raining. Oh, wait, no, the sky is blue. Okay, it can't be raining. Well, maybe a gardener came by and hosed it down. Oh, but wait a second, today's Sunday, it can't be that. So cognitive inferences, in a way, follow from your conscious experience, and they're ongoing and they can take a long time. But I'm focusing in on these perceptual inferences that go into the construction of your conscious experience. And these operations happen within that, probably 50 to 250 or 300 milliseconds between activation, I would say, of V1 cells and then wherever conscious experience happens neuronally, somewhere downstream, probably in the ventral stream or maybe parts of the frontal lobe. So I would say, Stan, 300 milliseconds doesn't sound like a very long time, but it's a really long time neuronally, and a lot can happen.
So Peter.
Yeah.
So are you familiar with Brentano and his idea of intentionality?
Yeah.
So you're saying, I'm just questioning you. You're saying seeing as seeing as, and Brentano was the first guy that used the word intentionality. He said consciousness is awareness, is aboutness. Isn't that, I mean, I'm not trying to say you're saying the same thing, but isn't there some kind of connection there?
Well, the results, so I think it's possible for consciousness to probably lack content. So in that case, of some pure sort of Buddhist state of consciousness, probably there's no aboutness in that case. But a lot of the contents of our conscious experience follow the results of these bottom-up operations that give us a world, and the results of those operations are full-blown interpreted stories. And vision is very much tied up with the emotions and desires and senses of aesthetics. The interpretations are all in there. You can think of your conscious experience as sort of pre-compiled. So you don't just see a bunch of pixels. You see a tiger coming at you, or you see a beautiful possible mate, or you see potential food. So this is very much related to the idea of affordances. Now you can call that aboutness. I would say it's sort of inference or interpretation. But I would argue against Brentano that consciousness has to be about something. I would argue that there are cases where we're able to either turn off or, an easy way for me to turn off my bottom-up visual consciousness operations is to close my eyes, right? I would say I still have visual experience when I close my eyes, but it's not really about anything in the world. So it's maybe a subtle distinction.
Peter, since you're sending little articles to me, I'd love to see an article by you or by anybody on how volitional attention changes the speed of the of your pre-conscious processing. I'm presuming there must be people that have done.
I didn't talk about changing the speed of neuronal processing.
But would you think more attention would speed up the pre-conscious processing?
Well, actually, okay, this is not my work, but there's work by lots of neurophysiologists like Marty Usray and others showing that attention does alter synaptic relay rates, or the probability that a spike in a presynaptic neuron will trigger a postsynaptic neuron's
I was hoping for more cognitive, not neural.
Oh, okay.
Wouldn't that be, doesn't?
Well, so I do think that attention alters the timing of neuronal events, and that has, probably some correlates with the mental operations that are happening, whether pre-consciously or cognitively post-consciously. But I wasn't really talking about that.
Huh. And do you know if any data's on that?
Yeah, there probably is. It just doesn't come to mind.
Yeah, okay. If that's sincere, then that would be a good topic.
I'd like to ask a little less philosophical, more concrete question. The experiment that you showed with the after image where the frame could lead you to an interpretation of vertical or horizontal early in the talk. Has anyone ever done, or would it mean anything to do if you presented the horizontal or vertical attention frame in a very short presentation? And how long of a presentation would it take in order to induce a biased orientation view?
Okay, so this was already done by Rob Van Leer and Stuart Ansis. And in fact, they did it before I did this endogenous version. So I saw their exogenous version, and I said, oh, well, somebody's got to make an endogenous version. So I just went and made it that evening. What they did is they showed two overlapping, I think it was a green, say, rectangle and a red rectangle, and then there was a gray overlap region. And then they flashed, they replaced that image with an outline. And then you saw the after image that would lie only within that outline and not the other part of the after image. And so that can be very fast. I don't remember the numbers, but it's in their papers.
Anstis and who?
Van Leer, V-A-N-L-I-E-R.
So could you elaborate a little bit about why that distinguishes exogenous and endogenous?
Okay, so exogenous attention is non-volitional. So this is why you find flashing lights on the internet really annoying, or people being loud or making clicky sounds. Attention goes automatically to sudden onsets in a sensory domain beyond a certain threshold. Endogenous attention is very different because it is volitional. you can choose to shift it, you know, to some domain of representation or some location at will. And it has a very different time course. In fact, the underlying neural systems are quite different. So even though, I mean, there's a problem in science is that we take these words from our ordinary language, like the word attention. And when we look in the brain, we find there's all these different neural systems that correspond to it. And they're quite different, right? You know, I could argue that the wake-sleep sort of system of the reticular activating system is part of attention. I could argue that this sort of acetylcholine-driven system coming out of the basal forebrain that seems to underlie endogenous attention is attention. Or I can argue that the sort of locus ceruleus sort of norepinephrine-based system that underlies exogenous attention probably is also attention. Or I can argue that the saliency maps in the posterior parietal lobe are attention, right? So there's a problem in taking one word from English and trying to apply it across the board. And what we end up having to do is create new words like endogenous attention and exogenous attention and so forth. And this is true again and again. You know, we'll take a word like memory from English, and then when we look closely at the brain, there's, you know, 7 different kinds of memory or something. Same for morality. You know, we say there's morality, but then we find, well, there's reasoning circuits up front, and there's disgust circuits in the insula. Probably the same with other words like intelligence. So we have to be really careful about taking these words from English and trying to, you know, the danger is saying, oh, English has one word, attention, therefore it must be one thing in the brain. And that's just not true. It's many things.
So Peter, I think your essay was really, I think, very, very nice. I think I think what you've done is really, really opened up the domain of attention much more than most other people have. Your examples of alterations of perception with attention are just way more powerful than ones that people are doing in the standard psychophysics. You're saying, though, that there's a whole domain of pre-conscious processing. And maybe you could flesh that out a little bit more, because that seems to be the whole machine. It's almost that this is a whole machinery of mental operations that is largely inaccessible to our, it's a little bit, is it like the Fodor modules or something like that? In other words, they're cognitively impenetrable systems that most of the time, and you sort of lay out, sometimes you can reach down and sometimes you can't. Could you just flesh that out a little bit? I think you say it in the paper, but maybe it would be worthwhile just saying it a little bit more.
Okay, let's think about a concrete example like apparent motion, where you saw, you know, either vertical or horizontal. Now, it has to be the case that there has to be some sort of buffer that is comparing input at time 1 with input at time 2. Because if such a comparison did not happen, you would never see motion, right? So if you experienced a dot when it appeared, at the moment it appeared, you wouldn't be able to compare it with another dot in the future that appears at a different location. Now think about when the second dot appears. So it goes from, you know, from here to here. When the second dot appears, well, it must be the case that there's a comparison with the previous position of the dot. But when the first dot appears, it can't be the case that the system knows where the second dot will appear, because it has no way of knowing that there will be a second dot, certainly when it will appear or where it will appear. So the position of the first dot has to be held on somehow for some duration. And the second dot, when it appears, has to be interpreted as having been a change in the position of that first dot. So you can use apparent motion as sort of the simplest way to probe the duration over which these comparisons can take place. So going way, way back to Corte's law, which I think is like 1915 or something, Corte showed that apparent motion depends on the distance, but the buffer has to be at least on the order of 150, 200 milliseconds long, because you see apparent motion over that duration. Now, if I have a first dot and then 20 minutes later I have a second dot, you're not going to see apparent motion. 1 minute is too long. 30 seconds is too long. 1 second is too long. So you can say, okay, what is the domain over which I do see apparent motion? And interestingly, it's in this domain of up to about maximum 200, 300 milliseconds. So there has to be some sort of buffer that compares the first position with the second position. So we know just from that simple example that there has to be some buffer that is allowing comparisons. But I'm arguing that within this temporal buffer between, say, retinal activation for sure, but let's say just V1 activation later, and whatever neural correlates lead to a conscious experience, there's probably about a quarter second to 350 milliseconds delay. And in that delay, your brain is trying to figure out what the heck is going on out there in the world that gave rise to this succession of inputs that are held within that buffer. And so part of those automatic bottom-up, you can argue, like Fodor, dedicated, encapsulated, rapid, parallel operations are these constancy operations. And they result in one interpretation or another. My point is, though, that unlike Fodor, I'm arguing that these high-level mental operations like volitional attention can actually reach down into these, what he thought were encapsulated systems and alter the domain over which subsequent bottom-up constancy operations will take place, which will lead to one conscious experience or something radically different if you shift how your attention's applied. So I don't know if that explains it, Ken, but
Yeah, that's very reasonable.
Just as a follow-up, I would have thought that apparent motion, which is like a 300 millisecond delay, might be in the realm of two-photon imaging, where we're looking at neurons. fMRI can't do it that fast, but maybe these new technologies are able to see the neural correlates of apparent motion. Does anybody know anything about that? Have you ever heard of any experiments to look for neural correlates?
well, sure. There's a lot of work on the even with MRIs. You're able to. So I think the best MRI experiments are ones where the stimulus remains constant, but people go and have very different percepts. So I could create an MRI experiment, and in fact, I think Lars Muckli might have done this with. Anyway, so I could say, press this button if you see vertical in apparent motion, and press the other button.
You'll have to repeat yourself. You hear
say, okay, these were vertical percept brains, and those were. Sorry. So these experiments have been done in MRI even. So I can have someone see the apparent motion quartets, and they can see vertical or horizontal, and I can say press button A when you see vertical, and press button B when you see horizontal. And then after the fact, I can say when I can sort all the brains that were collected with MRI or functional MRI, and say, well, when they saw vertical, these were the functional patterns, and when they saw horizontal, these are the patterns, and then I can use different techniques to find those areas of the brain that have a difference, either in bold signal level or pattern. And sure enough, it's areas like MT that show a difference when people see horizontal versus people see vertical. But importantly, the stimulus is identical. So the only difference is in the processing. So the difference you get is due to the processing, not the stimulus. So in that case, you might say, well, maybe the neural correlates of the percept of horizontal or vertical lies in MT. That would be consistent with the data, but it's not guaranteed, because maybe your conscious experience of vertical motion versus horizontal motion happens downstream of MT.
Okay, Carla has.
Hi, is this the speaker?
You'll have to talk very loud.
Okay. Peter, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. So I'm coming more from the physics background sort of things, and I have a question in relationship to, since you've been talking about this temporal, say, movement, apparent perception, and so on, talking about the apparent directionality of time perception. So there were some experiments and some theoretical work done by two people, one Vitello and Freeman, in relationship to apparent backward time motion in association to expected output versus actual output. So in relationship to what we would expect as what will be happening as the next event or as the actual experience. And so I wonder if you mentioned a little bit on this aspect, I believe, somewhere in the middle of your lecture. And I wonder if you would consider constancy operations as being associated as a in-between process of understanding an event, expectation of the event, and our apparent sensation of time directionality.
Okay, I didn't fully understand that. I assume you're not talking about backward flow of time in reality. Are talking about perceived.
Correct, perceived.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So there are old data that show that people can have illusions of perceived sequence. I think Stelmach and Herdman or something that's in 1970 or something. They showed if you tend one way, something seems to appear first. If you tend to a different way, the other thing appears to come first. So these kinds of illusions of time order are subtle, but they do seem to exist. And attention also seems to play a role in that. Now, how can this arise? Well, I would say that it arises because inputs come in fact, in a certain order, but then they have to be interpreted, and they're interpreted by these sorts of operations, these preconscious, unconscious, largely bottom-up operations that are trying to recover what's really going on in the world. And they can make mistakes, and they can be influenced by top-down input, right? So, I mean, in the case of the apparent motion quartets, there's no motion, in fact, in the world at all. Your brain is constructing it, and you know, this is consistent with what's going on, but this is also consistent with what's going on. My guess is that when events, in fact, come into the system within a very tight temporal order, like 10, 20, 30 milliseconds, something like that, the system is, you're playing with the noise of the system, and the system might say, you know, I'm not sure which came first. And then in those rare cases, you can alter perceived direction of time.
Okay, would it be possible to send those references or to say those references one more time, maybe to Stan or through the...
Yeah, I can look some of them up. I wrote an article about time perception at one point, and I can send you that too. I think those references are in there.
Yeah, you can just send it to me and
great.
I can get it to Carla.
Okay, and I'll send you some of the references that I've been looking at. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you.
Take care.
Well, maybe there's time for one more question. I'll have another.
Peter, I'm interested in attention reset and the neurophysiological correlates. Is phase reset one that is working on the same timescale that you're interested in?
Define phase reset, please.
Phase reset is the relative phase of gamma, theta rhythms that apparently reset about every 100 milliseconds in parts of the cortex, according to Freeman's study.
Okay, so I'm very interested in this issue of time locking. So when you talk about phase, you're really talking about temporal relationships. I'm very interested in this issue of time locking of gamma and high gamma to the underlying low alpha or high theta. And I think that this arises because this underlying low gamma and high theta, low alpha and or high theta is indicative of this buffer, right? So if you take 7 hertz or 5 hertz, if you divide 1,000 milliseconds by 7, what do you get? You get 150 milliseconds. If you divide it by 5, it's 200 milliseconds. This is kind of corresponding to this duration of the buffer that I think is going on between V1 activation and your conscious experience. And so I would really have you turn to the work of Rufan van Rullen. He's really the leader in this, but recently Sabina Kastner's been getting into this and others, showing that depending on the phase relationship between an event and the underlying low alpha or high theta rhythm, you'll either become conscious of this or that, or you'll become conscious or not conscious at all. And the model that I've been arguing for, think of the ventral stream as sort of a bucket brigade. You know what a bucket brigade is, right? When there's a fire, some people are at the river, and other people just pass a bucket down. Now think of the bucket brigade as the ventral stream. And the rate at which the bucket is passed from one person to the other, that's your low alpha or high theta rhythm. And the processing is happening in those buckets. So, for example, let's say I'm V2. I get my bucket from V1, and I do my processing, and I give it to V4. And if the stimulus hits at the beginning, when I just get the bucket, maybe I can do some processing in V2. But if the stimulus arrives at the end, where I'm giving my bucket already to V4, it cannot have any effect. And so these phase relationships are really key. And that underlying metaphor of a bucket brigade that I've been advocating explains Van Rellen's data and Sabina Kastner's data, but it also explains what attention is doing, because I would argue, and this is what I argued for in my book, attention is setting up bucket brigades. So when you pay attention to, say, some location, there's a signal, probably a cholinergic signal sent down from the basal forebrain or other areas like LIP down to V4. And this sets up a bucket brigade going back to V1 and all the way to the hippocampus. And so what you get when you pay attention, you are turning on complete information processing from V1 all the way to the hippocampus. And so you get a figure, and you get objects, and you get events. But without attention, all the processing remains local. It doesn't get set up in a bucket brigade all the way to the hippocampus for recognition and identification. So that's a kind of long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's a very deep question. And there's a lot of work yet to be done on this relationship of gamma and high gamma phase locking to underlying low alpha, high theta. And I think it's very deeply related to this issue of the preconscious buffer and the processing that can happen within it.
Thank you. That reminds me of Buzaki's idea of a buffer for short-term memory, but we can talk about that offline. And also, Freeman has a clocking mechanism he described in a in a paper titled "Deep Something" in the late 2000s, which gets to the physiology of the clocking mechanism. I'll send that to you separately.
All right, thank you.
Well, time is up. Thank you so much. In fact, this
it was a pleasure, Stan. Thank you for listening.
And whoever's interested in this free will book of yours, make sure you contact me because I'll be reading it.
Okay.
We'll be in touch.
All right, Stan, Ken, everybody, good seeing you guys.